And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Hello, welcome to the aviation section of Alaska Weather. I'm Eric Holloway with the National Weather Service for October 20th, 2023. A couple options for you to further refine your aviation weather forecast out on the World Wide Web at weather.gov/Alaska, and also a phone-driven menu system. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please email us. Taking a look at the satellite image this morning, you can see some cloudiness there in the Aleutians Island extending into the southern Bering Sea associated with a low pressure system just south of Unalaska. Otherwise, some pretty good flying conditions, as we'll see here in a minute, across much of the southern mainland. You will see some cloudiness along the north slope into the Brooks Range. Also some pretty good flying weather down in southeast Alaska. And lastly, you can see the next system showing up there way out there in the western Aleutians or extreme eastern Russia. For flying weather on Saturday, you can see that cloudiness getting held up there near the Brooks Range. IFR conditions expected there. Marginal conditions across the rest of the north slope and into the Arctic Ocean. And some areas of marginal conditions down through the Bering Sea and into the Aleutians. Otherwise, an area of IFR conditions expected right there in the eastern Aleutians. Otherwise, like I said, some pretty good flying conditions across the southern mainland into the Panhandle for Saturday morning. A little bit of cloudiness there in the Panhandle along the coastal range and southern end of the Panhandle, but otherwise pretty good flying weather. And that again extends into Saturday afternoon for, again, pretty good flying weather across much of the southern mainland and the Panhandle. Otherwise, some IFR conditions showing up there in northwestern portion of Alaska with IFR conditions there. Otherwise, marginal through much of the central mainland interior and across the north slope, and marginal conditions down through the Bering Sea and Aleutians. Then for Sunday's weather, looking at, again, continued pretty good flying weather across the southern mainland into the Panhandle. Otherwise, marginal conditions through the interior and Brooks Range, IFR conditions associated with the next system showing up there with IFR conditions in that northwestern pocket of the state. And marginal condition down through the Bering Sea into the Aleutians. Otherwise, IFR conditions showing up there in the western Aleutians. And again, for Sunday afternoon, looking at IFR conditions continuing in that northwestern area of the state. Otherwise, marginal conditions in portions of the interior, banking up there against the Alaska Range. Otherwise, marginal conditions in the Bering Sea and Aleutians. Again, good flying weather across much of the southern mainland into the Panhandle of the state. So past conditions on Saturday, the only place that will see some cloudiness and IFR conditions is along the north slope. So Anaktuvik Pass, IFR improving to marginal. And then we have Adigan Pass, IFR conditions to improving to marginal conditions there on Saturday. And then for much of the Alaska Range passes and in South Central, see some VFR conditions, Lake Clark and Merrill, VFR conditions, rainy VFR, windy pass, VFR conditions, Isabel, same story there. Mentasta, VFR conditions. And then we have VFR conditions in Tanita, as well as Portage, and even down in the Panhandle, Chilkoot and White Pass, VFR conditions expected there. Then for freezing levels for Saturday morning, you can see the surface freezing level there along the coastal areas of the western mainland and into the Gulf of Alaska and over into the Panhandle of the state. And then you get into that tight gradient of above freezing levels across the Bering Sea up to 10,000 feet over the western Aleutians. Otherwise, in the Gulf of Alaska, anywhere between 2,000 and 6,000 feet in that area of the state. But otherwise, freezing levels will be at the surface across much of the mainland. For icing conditions on Saturday, looking at 2,000 to 8,000 feet up there in that northwest pocket of the state, above 10,000 feet there in portions of the Alaska Peninsula, and above 6,000 feet over there in the western Aleutians with considerable moderate conditions expected there. For the jet stream on Saturday, ridge of high pressure out there in the western Aleutians, driving some northerly winds down through the eastern Bering Sea with 110 to 100 knots coming across there Otherwise, across much of the mainland, northerly winds there up to 95 knots over in the eastern mainland, and 100 knots cutting across the panhandle over there, but otherwise a low pressure system just south of the Alaska Peninsula, driving some higher winds there with that pressure gradient there with 75 knots in the Gulf of Alaska in a northerly fashion. For 9,000 foot winds on Saturday, looking at winds again from the northerly position there across much of the mainland up to 45 knots in the Brooks Range, otherwise decreasing wind velocities across much of the mainland, but still out of the north, and that extends down in the Panhandle with 35 to 40 knots there in the Panhandle area. Otherwise, ridge of high pressure over there in the western Aleutians and a low just south of the eastern Aleutians, with strong winds in a more southerly wind direction over there in the western Aleutians up to 70 to 75 knots. Then 3,000 foot winds, again ridge low pressure system in that area over the Aleutians. And again, some northerly flow, lighter this time, with up to 45, anywhere between around 30 to 35 to 40 across the Brooks Range, but otherwise light and variable across the mainland into the Panhandle. Then lastly, for turbulence on Saturday, surface to 6,000 feet up there near the Brooks Range, and surface to 4,000 feet in portions of the Aleutians.